Okay, so today we are analyzing one of my favorite chess games of all time, Magnus Carlsen versus Bosiocic. I'm going to go through the opening pretty quickly just because this is very standard London system stuff. After castles, we see bishop b5 and then knight e7. So we'll go through the whole game and then we'll talk about a few key points, knight e7 being one of them. So after knight e7, we see bishop d3, and it's worth noting this is kind of your typical London system position with the exception that this knight is on e7 as opposed to c6. And so now we see b6, and the typical response to b6 is e4, obviously threatening e5, forking both the bishop and the knight. We get an exchange on e4, and after bishop takes e4, we see the rook is being threatened, so black responds with rook to b8. And this is a bit inaccurate just because it allows white to take here for free. If black were to recapture, for example, they would obviously lose the rook. And so taking on g3 is essentially forced. And now we see the reason for white bringing the bishop to g3 in the opening. After recapturing with the h-pawn, the h-file opens up and we see there's just a ton of pressure on that h7 pawn. And black needs to deal with this in some fashion. The way that black chooses to deal with this in this position is by playing f5, and unfortunately this is a blunder. The reason being this allows for white to initiate the queen trade, brings both rooks into position for a potential fork if that pawn is allowed to get to c7. Black responds with knight to d5, covering c7, and after takes, we see that there's no longer a threat of the fork. And after rook d1, if we look and analyze this position, although the big threat of losing the rook is gone, we do see that this position is pretty terrible for black. If you look piece by piece, this rook is cramped, bishop is undeveloped, there's a passed pawn that black needs to deal with. And if you look at these two rooks, one is clearly better than the other. This rook here on d1 is a very, very strong attacking piece. If allowed to get to the 8th rank, I mean, this would just be devastating for black's position. And really, what this means is that this rook here on d5, its only purpose is to keep this rook from doing anything. And so black decides, rightfully so, that the best use of this rook is to get rid of it, trade off one bad rook for one really good one, and try and hold on for some sort of play after. We see bishop a6, knight e5, rook c8, and then c4, b5, and I love this move, b4. If you look at this position, I mean, really, this bishop might as well not be in the game at this point just because of how out of play it is. And black realizes this and decides to take on c4. And Magnus says, you know what, take the pawn because I've got a4 threatening b5, and this would win the bishop in this position. And so black decides, rightfully so, get the rook out of the way, play check. After king c2, we get rook d5, and after f4, black rightfully resigns. It doesn't really make sense to try and hold on for anything here. I mean, if you were to get something like, I guess, g5, b5 is coming, bishop c8, you know, we're winning material. There's really nothing to be held on to for black here, especially against the world champion. So let's go back to the beginning and go over some key points. I believe the first thing that would be worth getting into is this bishop b5 maneuver and then knight to e7. So why did black play knight to e7? Well, if black allows any sort of trading on c6, there are some complications that can lead to the loss of a pawn. We see here that after queen a4, this pawn is hanging, and black can defend, but white still has tactics that allow for, after queen a3, putting a lot of pressure on this pawn, and black just doesn't have the resources to defend. I mean, you could bring the knight in, but we've got a knight of our own, and really this pawn is going to fall. And knight e7 avoids all of those complications. So it is a good move, and it has been played before. Bishop d3 and then b6. So this is worth noting that, and you may have noticed this, that without the knight on c6, this line is a little bit different than what you would typically see, right? So let's pretend for a second that Magnus played bishop d3 here. It is a mainline move to play b6, at which point you would see e4 like we saw in the game. You would get this exchange on e4, but in this position we're hitting the knight, we're not hitting the rook. Black can pretty easily defend with bishop b7, and here we can actually have a full trade on c5 because there is no threat of capturing the rook because the rook is still on a8. And here, I mean, there are some tactics still. You know, queen a4 threatens to win this piece. We would probably see rook c8 here. Maybe we threaten the queen. I believe this position has been played numerous times on the Grandmaster level. This is nothing too crazy. But when we look at the actual game and the position that we got, you know, after knight e7, b6 isn't as good because we noticed obviously that this hits the rook. And had black gone with something other than rook b8, maybe there wouldn't have been so many tactics. I think probably knight to d5 would have been best. And at this point, we probably end up seeing an exchange here. You know, no risks of losing the rook, maybe castles, and this is totally playable for both sides. But after rook b8, you know, obviously we had what we had, and this is the next real key moment, which is f5. Black really needed to initiate the queen trade before doing this. Had black played queen d1, we would have had the exchange on white's side of the board, and then f5 allows black to push white back and actually gain some material in the process. So that was the last, that was really the big mistake or the big blunder of the game that really turned the tides in white's favor. Let's see, are there any other big moments here? Not really. I mean, this is just solid play from Magnus into the endgame and, you know, leading to a pretty decisive victory. And as we discussed before, I mean, this position is just so solid for white. Really, there's nothing, no advantages to be gained. There's really nothing to squeeze out of black's position here. So the resignation made a lot of sense. So I hope you enjoyed this game as much as I do. And yeah, see you next time.